There we are. Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Oh,
Hello.
This is Nancy Jean, Medium Kim, Bill, who is a chaplain, and me. We have decided to come together today to talk about a difficult subject, which shouldn't be so difficult. And the way it came about was I was watching Nancy Jean's video when she was mentioning her husband and the conversation that she had with her husband when her husband was in the hospital. And it was so beautiful. And I talked to her about it, and I mentioned my hospital issue with a relative that was horrific. And we decided to maybe put on a show about what to do, when to have the conversation before you get into a hospital situation. I think I got it right, don't I?
Yeah.
Okay.
The show I ran was on April 20th, and that is actually the reason I did the show was my husband was born on December 2nd. I was born on May 2nd. He died on November 20th, right before his 72nd birthday. That April 20th was right before my 72nd birthday. And I woke up in the morning and I literally was told, you need to explain this because now you're on your own, kid. And I know that was him talking to me because that's what he would say. He was 20 years my senior and he called me kid. And it's like I have all the time now that he didn't have. But what I wanted to talk about was the build up to the day that he died. And the build up started actually 20 years before when I went through a church program about death and dying. And I brought home the literature, and we're going to put a link to a thing, and Bill can talk about it more about options you have to discuss death and dying. Because I get it all the time from people in readings. Is Uncle Charlie really happy on the other side? And they're so traumatized by a death. But if you know where the person is and you know what their wishes are and you know what your role is in their passing, it makes it so much easier. And my husband had had a stroke in September, actually on the day I started a completely new job. You talk about a day when your life completely changes. I started being a campaign manager. He had a stroke. He was in the hospital. I went back to the candidate and said, you don't have to keep me. And she said, oh, hell, I could hire somebody else and they'd have something happen. So we're going to go with this. 3 months later, he died because while they were treating for the stroke, which he was recovering from really pretty well, they found inoperable esophageal cancer. And he just looked at me. And because of the conversations we'd had years before, we both know that there's an end. And we both know what our role would be if it was reversed, where he would take care of me and I would take care of him. So I got him to a hospice where they made him comfortable, and he passed peacefully on November 20th. While I was holding his hand at 6 in the morning, and we were listening to Beethoven, which is what he'd wanted played in his room all the time. And he went across, and I didn't see him cross because I don't do that sort of thing. Medium Kim can explain all that, but I felt him leave, and I came home and I just collapsed in my bed and slept for about a day, and then woke up, and I could pick the pieces up without those pieces being me.
Yeah.
You know, I had a 13-year-old son that I had to walk through this. I had other people who were close to him that I had to walk through it. But he and I had settled, and I didn't have to break apart for him to pass across. And some people, one woman said, well, you almost seem so cold and distant. And I was like, no, I'd already been through it, and I knew he's in a better place.
Right.
So,
And it's interesting because when I was doing in my thing, the decision-making process was just too emotional. So it didn't make any sense. I was always second guessing and stuff. So I think that it's so important to actually, how do we start that conversation, especially when somebody doesn't want to start that conversation or you're feeling a little funny about it?
I think, what I was going to jump in here, Danny, is that if we normalize death, then it becomes an easier conversation. But maybe our society isn't quite having it normalized yet, but it is getting better. I think we are and I'm noticing a big awakening also around death, but it's not quite normal enough, and people are still saying, "Oh, we never talked about that." But yes, you should start talking about it when you're 20, right, or when you don't have anything, so that people know.
Yeah.
That actually, when I did a hospice for a while also, and I was visiting my parents who were in their late 80s at this time. And so my mom and dad were hanging around, and my mom had had a heart attack earlier, a few years before that. And so I asked them, it's like, so have you ever thought about death? And my mom looked at me, and she's smoking her cigarette, and the oxygen tank is right next to her. And she blinks her eyes and goes, well, why would I? And I just started laughing. It's like, oh, well, I'm just a hospice chaplain. And, I thought I'd just ask. And my dad, on the other hand, and this sort of ties in with both Medium Kim and Nancy Jean, is when I was probably in my late 20s, he said, I'm going to be dead in 5 years or so. And it was such a shocking thing to hear. And he said that for the next 30 plus years. And when he finally died, family sat there and said, you're right. He was finally right. But he had done the advanced directives, the trusts. And even though mom would never talk about it, it's like everything was organized. So though we had here's someone who said, I'm not talking about it, that dramatic worldview in some ways. And then, my dad just had everything in order. So when he died, we actually literally just showed up and were taken care of, by, everything was planned. And, I see that as probably one of the greatest gifts we can give our loved ones, is to sit down, talk about it years before any issues come up. And then it's like, what is it that's important for me to give my loved ones so they don't have to worry about it? He even wrote his obituary out.
And I think going back to that, that's the final stage, but what happens when you get into a hospital, and you find out that either that the doctors are taking over and you don't have a say anymore, or you can't talk, like with a stroke victim, and they're just there. And how does that go about? How does that work when other people are your voice? You need to have a say in that, and that's where the advanced directive comes in. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, I'll say it now. We're cramping into the laws of your state, and different states have different rules and different ways that they handle it. So yes, the more detail you can give them, the better. But my father was a doctor, and I had two brothers who were doctors, and I lived in hospitals as a kid. And doctors like to play God. But in actual fact, I learned long ago that you're the person who's in charge. I mean, ultimately, if you leave the right words and the right directives and the right people to run it. When my husband was dying, I called my dad every day, and we talked about where we were with things. And he was a retired physician at that point. And he said, well, how are you picking this hospice, and what are all the steps you're going through? And he told me, he said, honey, this is the hardest journey of your life, because to doctors, someone dying is a failure, instead of someone dying is a natural part of why we're here. And the irony of all this is, what I didn't know is my mother had been diagnosed with something that was going to be terminal very soon, at the same time, parallel to my husband. They didn't tell me because they didn't want me to worry about it. And when they called, he died in November. When they called me in early February and said, Mom's dead, I was like, what? Because my father had been having heart attacks since his 30s. They were in their 80s. What do you mean Mom's dead? Who's going to take care of Dad?
Yeah.
And it ended up, the whole time he was seeing how he was finding hospice and all that stuff, he was taking notes, because they had to put her in a hospice setting. But I'll tell you about this is sort of my family story on death and how I'm going to die. My grandmother wrote us all a letter one winter and said, I love Christmas, but I don't think I could take another winter. She lived in a part of Ontario where winter is winter like you've never seen. If you have never lived in Ontario in the winter. She climbed into bed on December 27th and told the woman who was taking care of her, she said, oh, bring me my tea at 5:00. When the woman came in, she was gone. She just fell asleep in her bed and went away. My mom, the day they took her to hospice, she looked at it. She knew what was coming up. She knew the nurse had said she's no longer capable because of circulation problems of being left in a non-hospital environment, non-medical environment. They dropped her. They went to the hospice with her. And my mom said, Larry, go home. They don't have my room ready yet. They've got me in this comfortable place. And my brother paid for them to have a chauffeur. So Bill, their chauffeur, took my dad home. When they got back to where they lived, my dad put the key in the door, the phone rang, and he said, she's dead. And Bill said, oh, Doc, we just dropped her off a half hour ago. She can't be dead. So Bill picked the phone up. He turned around, looked at my dad and said, she's dead. The nurses said they left her for 5 minutes. They came back in. She was gone. But we don't all have the grace in life to be offered those opportunities. And I don't know that you can plan that, but it was much more of a shock when no one told me my mom was dying when I found out my man died. Yeah. So if you're involved in that, don't leave a family member out because you're worried about their feelings. Trust me, that was 2005 and my feelings still aren't healed about that.
Yeah.
And there's, looking at a child who's like 2 years old or 15 years old, there's different ways of telling someone, but it's really, especially for the younger children, to be excluded from the process creates a disconnect, and they're going to try and create a story about why their mother or father died. And it's going to be centered around them not being good enough, more than likely. And it can cause long-term suffering for that person. And finding a way that's gentle that can communicate, I'm sick, so that it just becomes part of their living process. And that's one of the things. Is like when we talk about this process, it's dying is part of the living process. We start dying the minute we're born in some ways. But we don't talk about it. And that's the power. It's like, as Kim was saying, it's like we need to have this as a normal conversation. And then it's not scary. The more people I bring into a conversation, or when I'm scared, my fear rises the more I don't share. And the minute I start sharing it with other people, I'm sharing that load and that fear, and my fear drops because I'm being held. And so if people are uncomfortable about talking about it, just having normalized conversations, ideally not in a hospital. Because the job, it's like the emergency department, going back to what Danny was asking earlier. It's like if you go into the emergency department, doctors really don't care they're not going to be looking at paperwork. Their job is to get you stable so that you can survive this event. So if you have an advance directive and you're safe, which you should never have, or wherever it is, they're not going to be looking for it unless somebody's got it and they're flashing it in the doctor's face.
So when you said not to have an advance director in a physical safe is what you meant, correct? So yeah. Where should you have this advance directive?
Your primary doctor, if you have a hospital that you go to often, have it on record there. Have it with your loved ones. You can photocopy your advance directives and just pass them out to all the people. Have one in your glove box, in your car.
On your phone?
On your phone.
Yeah, but again,
okay.
You want something that's accessible. When you're with the phone, it's great if you're still alert. Then you can say, I have my advance directive. But more than likely, the doctor is going to be asking, if they're going to need to intubate you or do something extreme and you're still alert, they're going to ask you. As Nancy Jean was saying, we decide our fate, and the doctors will ask us what we want. We may not understand what they're asking, but they're going to ask.
Do any of you have an ICE thing on your phone? I have an ICE file in case of emergency.
Yeah.
They know to look for that. They can look in a phone. The police will look for it. I know, at least in Dallas, they do. It's who to call, but you can put the photocopies of your health directives and also any health problems you have. In my case, I have 2 artificial knees. So if something happens to my lower body, they know. If they don't see the scars, and they'd have to be blind and not see them, but who knows?
Right.
They know to handle sort of lower part of my body differently than a normally articulated human being. But the good thing about artificial knees is I will never disappear. My kids pointed this out after I had my knees replaced. Said, Mom, if you get rotted out in the bottom of the Trinity River, which is where bodies go in Dallas when no one wants them to find them, they said, they'll always have your knee number. I'm like, I can't believe you guys thought of it. Really?
And it has a serial number, so they'll know who you
Oh
are.
yeah, they'll know exactly. That's her knee. She's here somewhere.
Oh, that's funny.
But see, that kind of humor helps families deal with this.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And, you were talking about not having time to have that grief process, that anticipatory grief. So I think that is so important, whether somebody's, as a hospice nurse, whether somebody's in hospice or not, but like you say, knowing that they're sick, because that gives the closure, the time to say goodbye, and all the celebration you want to do before they actually go on.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. That's so important. And not to keep secrets. I totally agree. Yeah. When somebody tells me that, I don't want to let the family know that I'm dying, even though, they're on hospice, but don't tell anybody I'm dying. That's like, no, we need to talk about it.
Yeah. Or the reverse, where the family's saying, we don't want to upset her because she's dying, so we don't want to tell her she's dying. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
odds are the person already knows, and they're not saying anything because they don't want to upset you. So you have this barrier that comes up between people.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes the transition harder because you need to be barrier free for that to have. And I don't want to get caught up in a good transition or a bad transition, because there isn't one, but it's an easier transition when everyone's on the same page.
Oh yeah.
So what are some of the challenges that you all see to getting people all on the same page?
Well, for me, Bill, you work in the hospital and I work in the hospice. By the time somebody's in hospice, they've already decided, usually, this is the end of life. And so they've kind of already come to an agreement, but there's still differences in how families are going to either, no matter what, they think, there could still be a miracle. There's going to be some of those in the family. And so, I just think it's education as much as possible. And of course, you never want to have somebody lose hope, but education about what's realistic. And then also what to expect, of course, if somebody's declining. This may be going off the subject, but talking about having an advanced time and educate, even for us, right? Education about what to do. I think that's really, really big. And that's why we're doing this today.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There's some of the things that I see, and is going into the emergency department, you've got a different focus there. So some people have been on hospice, and then the family gets nervous because the person's in pain or uncomfortable, and then they call the ambulance. Ambulance rushes them to the emergency department, and that hospice orders sort of go out the window because they're stabilizing the patient. So, being able, and again, this is education, if somebody chooses to be on hospice, it takes some courage to sit there and allow them to be on hospice.
Yep.
So that when things get uncomfortable, you manage it at home. You let that person die where they want to die. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Family, they just get scared because they're not ready for it. Whether it's emotionally or, if their loved one's in pain, there's a good reason to find ways to get rid of that pain. And so hospice nurses are great at doing that. Guilt with families comes up a lot, especially if there's a family member that's not been close to the loved one. They come back into the picture after being estranged for 5 years, and they sit there and say, do everything, do everything. And it's not about them following the wishes of their loved ones. It's dealing with their own guilt that they haven't been around for 5 years, and they want to show that they're the loving child.
And what happens? And what happens? So if you are in that situation, and you are following the wishes of your loved one, another person comes in and is disruptive of that process. What can you do to still honor that the person's wishes that's in the hospital? Who do you go to help?
Worst case scenarios, you end up with an ethics committee making decisions, because if you have two family members arguing, then the doctor is going to have to sit there and go, who's the person who knows the patient the best, who can be the spokesperson for that patient? And they can't just go, oh, well, this person's obviously dying, so I'm going to pick the person who agrees to put the patient on comfort care. If two family members are clashing, then they got to figure out who's the spokesperson.
And is that where the document really comes in handy?
Yeah, the document eliminates any of that thinking. It's like, if you have an advance directive on it, there should be either, if you haven't picked an agent, you've let your wishes be known so the doctors can know that. But generally, you have an agent who is your spokesperson for healthcare. And then there's no issue. That makes it really, really clear.
So it goes back. So it goes back to having that conversation, and making it legal for whatever state you're in.
Yeah.
Right, or whatever country you're in.
Okay, I have a comment on this one. I was lying in 2006 on a gurney, and they thought I had cancer in my lung because they found a funny spot, but it actually was a birthmark-like thing. But I had both double pneumonia. I had both bacterial and viral pneumonia, and I was really in bad shape. I was lying on a gurney in the emergency room. I get a phone call from my older brother who says, I think Dad's dying. And I go, okay, why do you think that? Fill this conversation. And it ends up, my father had left him, because my brother was an attorney, with the power of attorney over his health wishes. But then he never told him what they were. Okay. And so my brother's talking to me, and he's saying, what would Daddy want us to do? And I said, he does not want to end up on a machine. He was a doctor who had to take people off the machines when he practiced medicine. He had an extreme fear of those. And I said, what's wrong? He told me what was wrong. I said, he had necrosis in a part of his body. I said, he won't survive that surgery. You let him go. Just let them put him at peace. And he said, well, how do you know that's what Dad wants? And I said, because I talked to every daddy every day, including the day Bill died. I know what he wanted to do because he and I talked about it. And then my brother starts arguing with me, and the doctor who's trying to treat me takes my cell phone away and picks it up and goes, who the hell are you? And my brother goes, well, who the hell are you? And he said, I'm the doctor that's admitting your sister into the oncology ward. That stopped my brother's conversation. And then David, and I said, give me the phone for 45 seconds. I've been shutting him down for years. And the doctor handed it to me. I said, David, Daddy doesn't want to live like that. I'll explain my situation later. Goodbye. So my brother, I had a friend who was near him, and they said he was totally freaking out because now Dad's dying and his one surviving sister's dying. One sister's dying. So, and I didn't die. I didn't have cancer, and I'm here obviously, and I did get cured. But I was in the hospital for 12 days, and the first day I was in the hospital, my father died. And so the doctors did a whole TLC thing around me to make sure that I was cared for and comforted when they found out what had happened, because that was like a body blow in a body that couldn't take a blow.
Right.
Had my dad had the good sense to realize my brother David didn't have any sense at all, he wouldn't have left him. I mean, he would have made it plain to him what he wanted. So really, honest to God, just don't hand somebody a piece of paper and say, you'll know what to do best. Chances are you may be way overestimating them, and
Yeah.
they may not.
Yeah, the key is talking to their loved one. It's like, one of my brothers who shall remain nameless is my agent. And, you know, one of the things that's been really sweet is that the conversation comes up often. It's like, oh, in this scenario, what would happen? And so it's just part of a normal dialogue that we have, and I feel brings us closer together. You know, and having, again, that communication is just so crucial. Because people are dealing with guilt, and the key is picking an agent who will actually honor your wishes versus what they think is best for you. You know, that's another nightmare scenario where it's like, oh, I'm going to ignore what they've said because this is best for them. And I tell people when they're filling out a advanced directive form is you do not have to pick someone that you feel you should pick. You know, pick someone, whether it's in family or not part of your family, that you're close to, that you share this stuff with, so that they actually know what you want. Like Nancy Jean, you would have been the perfect agent because you have had these long running conversations with your dad. That's what you're looking for in an agent.
Yes, you know, that reminds me of a story. Because I had a lady, she had Parkinson's, and she did have advanced directives, and in her advanced directive, she said, I do not want to be fed. If I can't feed myself, I don't want anybody else to feed me. She went beyond a feeding tube and all that. She said, I don't want anybody to put anything in my mouth. But everybody was in shock, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she really would want that. But her daughter was a medical power of attorney and was a great advocate, even though her daughter lived across the country. But she and I talked, I don't know, multiple times a week about the situation, because there was a point when the facility where her mom was still feeding her, because it was against their ethical belief system, could not feed somebody. So,
wow.
And even when the daughter and I would meet with the whole team and say she does not want to be fed, they would still come by and quickly, like, put something in their mouth as they're walking by. Just really. And so what we had to do was move her to a different facility that would honor her wishes. But that's kind of a little bit, and we had to meet, a whole ethical committee. It was drug out way too long. But finally, when she was at a place who honored her wish, she was able to die peacefully within, days, actually.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's important to have everybody know, but also follow through.
And also, again, understanding what the effects of something is, like feeding someone who's in the dying process. In a lot of cultures, there's this fear of the hungry ghost. If they're not fed, if they're not taken care of, they're going to be searching in the afterlife. And that's not necessarily when the body starts shutting down, it doesn't need food anymore.
Right.
And so when we start forcing them to eat, we're creating suffering for them.
That's right.
Even though we're going, but I'm showing my love to them.
That's right. Yeah, it's a whole cultural shift, right? Because that's how we associate food and love together.
Yeah.
Right. So there is a whole different way of thinking. But you're right, exactly, with the different cultures. Some cultures are very much, I've seen syringes, forcing syringe feeding. But I always tell people they're not dying because they're not eating. They're not eating because they're dying.
Yeah. And that's a key distinction.
Yes.
Yeah.
That seems to help them understand. Yeah. And it's a lot of it is education. And even when a hospice patient goes to the ER, usually, at least the hospices I've worked for, the hospice nurse goes to the ER to meet them so that we can follow through with whatever treatment they're getting or not getting. The other day I was with somebody who I had to call the fire department because she would not get up from the floor, and I thought she was going to fight me if we were in this little bit of a battle. But so when the fire department came, they said, well, she said she was having chest pain. I said, do we need to do an EKG? And I said, no, she doesn't. She's on hospice. She's a DNR. Even if she had an irregular heart, what are we going to do? This is fine, because she had lung cancer. That's why she had pain. It wasn't because of her heart. Anyway, but you had to tell the police, or the fire department, no, she doesn't need an EKG. It's just that you have to have an advocate all along the way.
Yeah.
And where do you find these advocates?
Well, for me, as a hospice nurse, I'm an advocate for the patient, but the medical power of attorney, just like we were talking about,
Okay.
is an advocate as well.
Okay.
And where can they find the literature for all this stuff we're talking about? I think Bill provided us with a link.
Right. And I'll put the link in the description so that we can have those links and we can check those out. And we're about at 32 minutes. So, in wrapping this up, this is just when we started this, we just wanted to scratch the surface on this. We wanted to bring the conversation to the front of the line so that people will think about having this conversation sooner rather than later, because later is too late. We need to have this conversation now as we're getting older, and it doesn't even matter. Even young people too. That's got to be brutal. I wouldn't know how to think about that.
Right. Somebody's in a car wreck, right?
Right.
My son, who watched his father die, he came when Bill was first in the hospital, had a stroke. Patrick came every day on his way home from school and visited us, and visited his dad in the hospital room. And then when Bill and I sat him down and told him, this is not going in the right direction. And we told him together, we said, if you do not want to witness this, you don't have to ever come back again. But as long as you want to, you can. And the day you think this is more than you can handle, we trust you. And, mind you, this was a 6'2" 13-year-old.
Yeah.
So he said, okay. And finally one day he said to me, when his dad was towards the very end, he said, I can't go back. Tell Dad I love him, but I can't look at him like this.
Right.
And the Thursday before Bill died, Bill said, I really want to say goodbye to Patrick one last time. So I went and got him and said, you don't have to come. We're going to keep that promise. And he said, no, I think today I can. And I know it's close. And I'll hold it for the rest of my life if I don't say goodbye. So he went. Bill touched him and said, I always thought I'd see you be 18. I'm not going to make it. And Patrick said, that's okay. And he said, you go where you need to go, Dad. I'm fine.
Yeah.
And Bill said, I'm going to tell you one other thing. You do not have to take care of your mother. She's the adult. You are 13. You take care of you. And so they touched each other, and Patrick left, and he never saw his dad alive again. He's 30 now. He's had all this stuff since he went to college. He said, you never know what's going to happen. He thought his dad was this healthy, vigorous 6'2" man. And he fell down one day and didn't get up.
Yeah. And 13-year-olds think that they're invincible and that they're never going to die. And the fact is, anything we do, car wreck, looking at your phone, walking across the street, don't advise that. But, things happen. And so these conversations do need to happen early and often. And because I guess some things can change too, as far as what you want. So keep that conversation going. Yeah.
Yeah, they will change.
Yeah.
All right. So let's wrap this up. Does anybody else have anything else that they want to add before we go?
I was going to say, I think you can go online even and get your medical power, your advanced directives printed it out. I don't think it's going to cost, it doesn't cost a lot of money is what I'm saying.
Correct. Yeah. And there will be some links on there. And there, as far as trusts and wills go, Billa was talking about this in the very beginning. And I dealt a lot with trust, wills, and probate and for the families dealing with that. And there's benefits to having all that set up in advance. And you guys can look at that. That's a whole nother area. But and that doesn't have to cost a lot of money either. It can, but it doesn't have to. And just do it. Just the thing that I find is people start and then they don't finish it.
Right.
It's never going to be perfect. Finish it, and then you can adjust it and change it later.
And also let your family know what you want done with your body, what kind of services you want and stuff, because that's where they start fighting over the carcass, literally.
Oh yeah.
That can get ugly real fast. And so when Bill was dying, I knew he wanted to be cremated. And a day I woke up and I said, you can do this today. And I visited 3 crematoriums, picked the one I was going to use, hired them, got them all paid, so that when Bill died, they just knew to roll in,
right,
and get him out. And I'm not saying everybody needs to be cremated. There's a lot of other wonderful things you can do. You get planted and have a tree put over you and a bunch of other stuff. Or you can do a traditional funeral if your family's got a mausoleum or whatever you want to do. But make sure that's taken care of, because just getting you to the end, there's another end beyond the end. And that can be harder than the others.
Yeah.
The first advance directive I did, a friend of mine organized a dinner party, and there were about 10 of us, and we all went and we downloaded, I want to say it's 5 Wishes, one of the longer ones. And we had this really great meal together, a potluck meal, and then we sat around the living room and we all filled out our advance directives. And if anyone had a question, we could ask the group. And then we all witnessed each other's advance directives. So in one evening, and it really only takes like an hour to 2 hours to do an advance directive, a complicated one, like the ones in the links. It's so it's not a whole lot of time for that, but having community to do it with was, it basically forced us all to do it right then. There was only one guy who walked out and said, well, I can't do this, and smoked his cigarette while finished.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great point. Just getting together with a group of people, making it a celebration, and having dinner, because food is love is life. And we were just talking about that. So just have a big potluck, fill it out, get it done, and then pass it to your loved ones. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, anything else anybody want to say before we end this?
No, this is inspiring for me. So thank you for sharing, everybody.
Yeah, and thank you, Nancy Jean, for, putting that idea out there, because I need to go review mine. I haven't looked at it in 4 years, so it's time to review all that stuff. So,
I'd much rather help people deal with how they're dealing with this life, and when this life becomes a past life. I have people ask me about their past lives and what they learned from them. I really want to know what people learned from this life.
Yeah,
you've got to carry that lesson forward smartly.
Yes.
And I am coming, you're talking to a person. I was, long story short, being a psychic, I ran into a ghost, and I ran into the bad side of the other side. So I never have wanted to deal with the other side. But this made me have to look at where we go and how to not end up haunting a hotel in London like that guy did. But, everybody has a different story, and I love to read cards and have a happy ending. So it's not like it's happy, but I think it can be filled with joy because it's filled with your own choice.
That's the key. It's filled with your own choice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody that's watched. This has been great. And that's it. Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.